Tonight on Nation to Nation, National Chief RoseAnne Archibald wants to put internal strife in the past as the Assembly of First Nations charts a path forward.
We have to become a relevant organization. We have to get in touch with people, and we have to be connected to people. And so that's my work as National Chief.
Next week, Prime Minister Trudeau reveals his cabinet. One new NDP member of Parliament thinks Carolyn Bennett should be replaced.
It is warranted to ask for a different cabinet minister in that role, someone that's going to look at that Ministry of Crown-Indigenous Relations in a fresh new set of eyes.
Indigenous MPs are often dealing with a colonial institution with Parliament, but that doesn't bother this rookie MP.
I've been dealing with a colonial system since I was born.
I'm Brett Forster. Welcome to Nation to Nation. RoseAnne Archibald has hit the ground running following her historic win as AFN National Chief. From lobster boats on the front lines of the fight for Mi'kmaq fishing rights to the former Kamloops residential school, ground zero for the discovery of unmarked graves where she joined the Prime Minister earlier this week. It's been a busy 3 months for the National Chief, but she joins me from British Columbia to discuss what's next. National Chief Archibald, welcome to Nation.
Thank you, Brett. Happy to be here.
So what have you taken away from visiting all these communities?
Well, when I was elected, I developed a 100-day plan, and that 100-day plan was about trying to have as many actions and successes that I could in my first 100 days, and that included visiting as many communities as I could. My goal was to get to all of the regions and as many communities in all of those regions. But because of the pandemic, I just wasn't able to get to the Yukon or Northwest Territories or Alberta. But I did get to the majority of the regions. And being in communities for me is really important. It's about connecting to the leadership, connecting to people in communities, and really getting an understanding on what's happening on the ground today. As leaders, we're well-versed in the issues that face our people. And for me, having a connection into communities and understanding them and hearing them is a really important part of my work moving forward. So we did, for example, there is going to be now a resolution coming forward to establish a 2SL LGBTQIA+ council that will come in December. That was a part of my platform. I also talked a lot about women's issues in my platform, and we were very fortunate to have written a proposal and secured funding to start an elected women's leadership council at the AFN. A women's caucus. We raised $6.2 million for that, and a lot of that, half of that funding will actually go into the regions so that they can carry on that developmental work around ensuring that women's voices are heard and that their priorities are actioned on as women leaders.
Yeah, there's a lot happening, and probably what's happening next will be the announcement of Justin Trudeau's next cabinet. Do you think it's time for some fresh faces at the Indigenous departments?
Yeah, I'm hoping that in this term, we do get to see our first Indigenous minister in either the Cernak area or ISC, although I have to tell you, Mark Miller has been a really strong ally as a minister, and I've really appreciated the work he's done. I do believe it's time, though, to see more Indigenous faces in the cabinet and participating in ministerial roles rather than supporting or, parliamentary secretary roles, but really being ministers.
Mm-hmm. The AFN is often accused, or has been accused in the past, of cozying up with colonial governments. How are you going to handle your relationship with the Liberals going forward?
I've always been a relationship builder, and I'm known to be diplomatic. At the same time, I have to hold space to make sure that this government is accountable. When we think about some of the things that have happened recently, for example, Joyce Echaquan's death, and a number of issues that are rising to the surface, particularly around our children, this government has to be accountable for that, and this government has to take action for that. So I really have to hold space be two things. One is to be a good partner in the dialogue that we have with government, ensuring that they take action on our issues and move us forward, advance our priorities. And at the same time, to be able to speak the truth to them. You know, truth is really important during this time of truth and reconciliation. And I focus on truth because it has to be told. People have to be aware of the truth of Canada. And once we can get to that place where we actually look at the real picture of Canada, then we can begin to rebuild the story of Canada and rebuild those relationships and make sure that our inherent in treaty rights, particularly land rights, title rights, water rights, that all of those are respected by this government. So, you know, it's a dual role, and I want to be cooperative and collaborative at the same time. You know, I also have to be very truthful, and sometimes that's difficult in politics. You know, politics is not known always for the truth, and so I want to hold that space for that for sure.
When you took the reins of the AFN on the topic of reform, you were pushing for a probe into the AFN's financial policies. There were other investigations and allegations into gender-based discrimination, an alleged data breach, and bullying allegations against yourself. I know you called those allegations reprisal, but what is the status on all of those investigations?
The issue around, for example, the issue around investigations is those investigations have concluded. So the data breach investigation has concluded. The HR investigation has concluded. Those have been accepted by the AFN Executive Committee. There was motions passed on those. So those things are in the past. In terms of the path forward, we really need to make sure that we're guided by our principles and guided by our own protocols, not by corporate structure or these kind of legal things that crop up where people lawyer up and, you know, you get into a fight. We have to move beyond that. And that means we need our knowledge keepers to start guiding this organization to make sure that if there are problems, that we're addressing it in a trauma-informed way, and we're also addressing it from the perspective of who we are, which is how do we make sure that collectively we are in harmony with one another? How do we ensure that our relationships are restored every time there is an upset? These are traditional approaches that we have as First Nation Indigenous people, and that's how this organization has to start to move forward. And that's why it's really important to separate this political part of the organization from the administrative part, because the administrative part always wants to lawyer up, always wants to have lawyers involved, always wants to have this confrontational, negative space where nothing can move forward. Whereas our traditional ways are to bring people together and to do the healing that we need to do. And that's why I keep talking about the healing path forward. It's not only the healing path forward for Canada, but it's an internal healing path forward that we have to initiate. And I have initiated that work, and it is sensitive. And so you're not hearing a lot in the media, and you won't hear a lot about it because it involves people's feelings. It involves people's work. You know, it's such a sensitive matter, and it's not something that we can be broadcasting, you know, as we go through it. But once we go through that process of healing this organization and having that healing path forward, then we can actually begin to talk about these, what are the things that we're going to do to make sure that we don't go down those roads again. And I think that this is the work ahead for all of us.
Okay, National Chief, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank you for coming on Nation to Nation.
Thank you, Brett. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well. We have to take a short break, but when we return, I speak with rookie New Democrat MP Blake DESJARLAIS as he gears up for Parliament's return. Welcome back. The House of Commons resumes sitting in a month, and it'll have a few new faces when it does. Blake DESJARLAIS will be one of them. DESJARLAIS beat out the Conservative incumbent in a tight race to represent the riding of Edmonton-Griesbach. He hails from the Fishing Lake Métis settlement in Alberta and so became the province's only Indigenous MP. He joins me now from Edmonton. Welcome to Nation.
Thanks so much, and I'm really great to be here and excited to talk to many of your listeners.
So, first off, why did you decide to get involved in federal politics?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think my first instinct wasn't to get involved in politics, actually, but was to try to make a bit of a difference for our communities and to try to help the people that have helped me so much. You know, many of the people watching your show, of course, come from many of our communities and know firsthand the kind of struggles that we deal with, from things like housing to things like infrastructure to even clean water. So we're really far away from being perfect in our society still yet. And what motivated me largely to participate in this process was to ensure that those who've largely, I believe, failed in their mission or at least job to get these services delivered need to be held accountable. So I think that's a really important part, but also making sure we have room for young people, room for our elders, and room for our survivors to tell their story. We're still living in an era of truth, I believe, when it comes to understanding how reconciliation can be possible in Canada. So I'm really looking forward to being a fresh new perspective in that in the House of Commons.
What are some issues you do plan to prioritize when Parliament resumes?
Here in Alberta, particularly in Edmonton and across northern Alberta, you know, COVID-19 has been such a difficult time for so many folks. I know people who've lost loved ones. I myself have lost loved ones back home in Fishing Lake. For those who are watching there, we know the community members who've passed away in our community, and our hearts are with them and across northern Alberta. But the pandemic's not over yet. We still have a long ways to go. We're dealing with an unprecedented wave in Alberta right now. We recently just received some federal support after we pushed. And one of my very first things to do was to send the Prime Minister a letter along with my colleagues, our leader, Jagmeet Singh and Heather McPherson, looking at ways the federal government can support Alberta right now while we're going through the pandemic. And I'm happy to say that some of those recommendations have been implemented. However, there's still a lot more to go, and we have a long ways to go still yet. So that's going to be one of my top priorities, along with jobs. You know, Albertans, we know exactly what it's like to go through the boom and bust cycles for almost now 3 decades of what that looks like. You know, our parents, some folks, and even myself, I've worked in the oil sector before. You can't live that life. You can't pay your mortgage being laid off 4 times the same calendar year. And so I think Albertans, we're a labor province, we're an energy province, and we need to find out how we can continue to be those things moving forward.
It is a minority government gain, so how can the NDP leverage that to get results on some of those issues and on Indigenous issues in particular?
That's a great question, and I always think like the Liberals in some ways have a really unique kind of situation. You know, they know exactly where New Democrats sit. We want to see justice for Indigenous people. We want to see the ultra-rich taxed. We want to see them pay their fair share. We want to fix our healthcare system. So they know exactly where they can find a partner if they want to work on the issues that matter most to Canadians. The reality is, in a minority setting, that the Liberals have many options. They can go to the Bloc Québécois, they can go to the Conservatives, they can go to other parties to look for that support on particular items. And so it's probably going to be, I think, a hodgepodge of issues that are going to be presented to the 44th Parliament. But I think Canadians, when they went into this election, they didn't want a Liberal majority. They rejected that. And so they wanted people to get back to work. And so that's what New Democrats want to do. We want to get into the House, and we want to make sure that the laws and programs and services the country offers are going to be there for folks, but are also strengthened and in many ways rebuilt, because some of them just aren't working, like EI, for example.
Is the party prepared to withhold votes if the Liberals don't do enough?
I think every major political party always has to consider what is the line. You know, where do we draw the line on what is acceptable to us as a party to either vote or not vote for. But I think part of what our job as well as parliamentarians and as parties is to ensure that the mandate that we have been given is one that's actually fulfilled. You know, we were sent back in a minority setting to get back to work, and I think that's what we're planning to do. That's our first goal. And if there's any issues that, of course, cross that line for us, Canadians will find out pretty quick.
Your colleague, Charlie Angus, a couple weeks ago urged Trudeau to remove Carolyn Bennett as head of Crown Indigenous Relations when he announces his cabinet next week. Do you think it's time for a change at that department?
I've worked closely in the past with the folks at the Ministry of Indigenous Services and Ministry of Crown Indigenous Relations, where Minister Bennett is the minister of. And when the ministries were originally divided, she was at that point when she was formerly the Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada. And there's a history there where she was that minister who had to really do the work of dividing the ministry and seeing that work through. What I've heard from many Indigenous communities is that hurt them. That hurt. It was confusing for Indigenous nations to have to now work with 2 ministers, and then the last parliament, of course, 3 ministers. And so where do folks have to look? And I think that's been a serious problem for Indigenous nations, particularly throughout the pandemic, where they didn't know where to go. And that kind of, I think, process wasn't altered or changed in light of the tremendous circumstances Indigenous communities were facing. And so I do think that there is a warrant that is warranted to ask for a different cabinet minister in that role, someone that's going to look at that Ministry of Crown Indigenous Relations in a fresh new set of eyes, because I think that many Indigenous people feel, though she's been apathetic in many ways to many of their concerns, look at the track record. We still, and Mark Miller is included in this, we still don't have the ending of every single boil water advisory in Canada. That was something that was promised and broken. You can't promise something like clean water and not deliver it. That strikes a deep chord in mistrust with Indigenous communities who've been told these things before. We're still dealing in many nations with the cows and plow settlement on the prairies, something that was promised and never delivered. And so we have this kind of history of these promises and it ever happening. And so this is just another example of that. I think really it gets to the root of why reconciliation is going to be a very difficult and long journey for all of us. But it's going to take sacrifices and changes by the Liberals to make sure that we can actually achieve those ends.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there for now. Blake DESJARLAIS, I want to thank you for being on Nation to Nation, and good luck in the House of Commons.
Thank you very much, my friend, and thanks so much, everyone, for watching.
Okay, we have to take a short break. When we return, I speak with Nunavut's new MP, Lori IDLOUT. Welcome back. Nunavut is more than 3 times the size of France. It's the largest riding in Canada, but has only 1 MP in the House of Commons. Lori IDLOUT held the riding for the NDP after incumbent Mumalak Kakak opted not to run again. IDLOUT is a Inuk, a lawyer, business owner, community leader, and advocate who joins me now from Iqaluit. Welcome to Nation, Miss IDLOUT.
Thank you, Brett.
First, given that you are in Iqaluit, what is the latest on the water crisis there?
It sounds we're still having to pick up water bottles on a daily basis. We're told that the city is flushing the system and to expect to continue to possibly smell the odor of the hydrocarbon that's been smelled throughout our water system until at least the end of this week. And it sounds like there are plans to improve the filtration system in the coming weeks.
Is there something the federal government can do to respond and maybe help prevent this from happening again?
I had reached out to our mayor, Kenny Bell, and he said that he's been getting great support from not only the government of Nunavut, the federal government, Inuit organizations, businesses. So I think it's just a matter of making sure that the federal government's response is coordinated so that we can all be informed and ensure that we're following whatever directions we're being provided when it comes to our drinking water.
Housing is another crisis facing your constituents and has been for some time. How are you planning to hold the government's feet to the fire on that issue?
During my campaign, I talked a lot about needing to make sure that the federal government acknowledges and recognizes the strengths that Nunavut do have. A lot of the times when the federal government is providing services or is being advocated for, most times we're talking about the negative social indicators, low education rates, poor health conditions. I'd like to shift that conversation so that we're focusing on the strengths, like the skills that do exist, how Nunavut are able to thrive in an environment where most Canadians may not be able to. So really trying to find ways to make sure that we're using the strengths that do exist to find ways to generate the economy in Nunavut.
Climate change is still yet another crisis that's going to be impacting the North. What do you think of the Liberals' climate plan?
The climate plan is not strong enough. Nunavut have been talking about climate change for many years. We've had great leaders like Sheila Watt-Cloutier that have been talking to the international community about how Arctic residents have been seeing the impacts of climate change for too long. And so we just need to make sure that when it comes to decision making, that Nunavut, the Indigenous First Nations Métis groups are part of the decision-making process, because First Nations, Métis, and Inuit are the ones that are expert when it comes to our environment and our regions, and having thrived for generations, for a millennia. We have studied what our environment is like, and we have to make sure that we're part of the decision-making process when it comes to mitigating the impacts of climate change.
Finally, the House of Commons has not always proved to be a welcoming place for Indigenous MPs. It is ultimately a colonial institution. How do you propose to navigate around that?
I've been dealing with a colonial system since I was born. The education system in Nunavut has always been very colonial. When I went to pursue further education, getting my undergraduate degree, going for my law degree, I did experience racism. So I do feel that I've collected coping skills and a worldview where if I'm experiencing those kinds of challenges, I know that they're not directing it at me personally. And if I start to feel like I'm struggling with those kinds of behaviors, I've given myself a circle of support. I have a list of elders' phone numbers of whom I can call upon. They've given me permission for me to call them whenever I need to, not just for emotional support, but for guidance, so that I can make sure that I'm always doing what I was elected for, which is to represent Nunavut and to be the voice of Nunavut, and really just to make sure that more benefits are coming back to Nunavut.
Okay, Ms. IDLOUT, we have to leave it there for now. I want to thank you for being on Nation to Nation.
Thank you so much, Brett.
Well, that's our show for tonight. Next week, we'll take a look at the new Liberal cabinet, which is set to be announced on Tuesday. To check out our past episodes or download our podcast, go to aptnnews.ca/Nation to Nation. I'm Brett Forster. Have a great evening.